There you go. A good John Muir experience, as appropriate for this evening where we're going to be talking about John Muir. Thank you everyone for joining me. It's 8 o'clock. Let's make a start. I'll stop reading strange tales from John Muir. I'm going to bring all our guests in one by one. So I'm going to start with Harold. Harold, thank you so much for joining us from the States. Harold, you're the chair of the John Muir Education Committee in the Sierra Club. Now, I'm blown away to even know that there's a John Muir Education Committee. Why was there a need for a John Muir Education Committee?
Well, actually, I probably should say that committee is more historic now than actual. We established it back in the 90s when we created a curriculum guide for California schools tied into the curriculum standards for the state of California, and we tied in a program about John Muir with that. We worked with a group of people from outside the Sierra Club and within the Sierra Club to develop this curriculum, which we then published on our John Muir exhibit website and also in a booklet form, which then we got distributed to many of the schools throughout the state. And then we basically continued to work on the John Muir exhibit and stuff. So after, well, since 96, 2006, 2016, after that many decades of work, we find that that the executive director of the Sierra Club had never read our website and any of our information, and published other stuff about John Muir that was not consistent with the information that we were developing. So that whole thing is kind of gone in terms of a committee. I'm kind of hanging on, trying to get the website. The John Muir exhibit website is still the largest website and most comprehensive website about John Muir. And, you know, in a way, it's inappropriate to have everything all in one place, especially with an organization like the Sierra Club that's political and changes with the winds of what's currently in fashion. So I have another website, which is actually something that the Graham White from Scotland wanted to develop, johnmuir.org. It's the John Muir Global Network, and that's simply johnmuir.org. And I'm putting people there now because from there you can get to the Sierra Club John Muir exhibit, but you also can get to the Friends of John Muir Birthplace in Dunbar, and you can get to other places that are important to John Muir and his legacy. So tried to make that a little more comprehensive now. So that's where I'm at this point.
Wow, amazing, and amazing to think that he was part of the curriculum in schools in California. What a great history to teach. Where did you first come across John Muir then, and how did you get into this role?
Well, that's probably why I was interested in the education aspect, because I was 13 or 14 years old and I was a member of the Boy Scouts, and we were planning a trip to the John Muir Trail in the Sierra. And John Muir Trail, what's that? Who's that? So I started looking it up and reading about who John Muir was, and I immediately became hooked. Reading his life story was like an adventure story itself. And then I started reading his books, starting chronologically in time. So the first book I actually read was the story of my boyhood and youth about Scotland, growing up in Scotland, and then continued on. And the 1,000-mile walk to the summer, which is where he had a lot of his transformative experiences into the importance of nature from a non-anthropocentric view. That's where he kind of gave up his idea of everything's supposed to be about people. And once he then came to the Sierra, and in his journals in My First Summer in the Sierra, later published. It wasn't published until 1911, but a lot of the book is from his immediate journals. And in that, I'm struck about how often he refers to our fellow mortals and the plant people. The plant people. He just had this evocative view of nature, plants, animals, wildlife. The sheep he thought were a little silly, but
not his favorite animal.
Right. And anyway, it's I've kind of skim read through that book again. It's always been one of my favorite of the Muir books. It's just such a delight to read, and there's a lot of good stories in there, a lot of good quotations. One of the battles I have, you talked about how many of his quotations seem fit for social media, and that's true. But I'm also disturbed because there's a lot of misquotes now on social media that attribute things to John Muir that he never said or he would have said. So it's kind of an ongoing battle.
I imagine that one's a bit like playing whack-a-mole, but we'll get into all that data. Fabulous. You mentioned the John Muir Birthplace Trust there, so let's bring in Duncan. Duncan, thank you for joining us from Dunbar, from the John Muir Birthplace Trust.
Yeah, from Dunbar. I'm chairman of the John Muir Birthplace Trust, who own the John Muir's birthplace, the building that John Muir was born in, 126 High Street. And I've known Harold for, 30 years almost. I got involved in the 1993 because there was a proposal.
5, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but my involvement with John Muir became round about 1993 when there was a proposal to build a John Muir environmental world on a site of special scientific interest outside Dunbar, and that didn't seem appropriate. So to cut a long story short, in 1994, I was one of the founding members of the Dunbar's John Muir Association, which is now known as Friends of John Muir's Birthplace. And to cut an even longer story short, we managed to procure funding and purchase the building in the early 2000s. And in 2003, it opened as the John Muir's Birthplace. And that's probably one of my proudest moments. And certainly that started off, the journey on the John Muir Birthplace, the John Muir Birthplace Trust, the Friends of John Muir's Birthplace, and so on. So it's coming up for 30 years involvement now with John Muir.
Amazing. And I mean, it's almost a surprise to hear that it hadn't existed for longer. What was his birthplace before you bought it then? Was it just a private home?
It was quite interesting. It was on the high street, so it tended to be commercial properties. So we purchased it from a photographer, commercial photographer, and so they had essentially a studio on the ground floor, and the other 2 floors were essentially just rented accommodation until they took the top floor and made it into a pastiche of a flat that would have been typical of Muir's time. But nothing in it was original. Nothing existed from Muir's birth in that house. And in fact, prior to it becoming a photographer's studio, it was a dry cleaner's. And the middle 2 floors were essentially occupied by massive, great steel cylinders for the dry cleaning. So in actual fact, when we redeveloped the John Muir's Birthplace, there was a great deal of, not a great deal, but there were some factions that didn't like the proposal for the building because they wanted to make it a sort of pastiche of what a building would have looked like interior-wise in 1838, 1839. And of course, none of the interior actually remained. So we had very good architects that developed the interior. And so essentially the exterior remains and things like the fireplaces remain and so on, but it's actually a bespoke museum, information center. And through the years, I've collated the visitor book comments, did a word cloud of those, and the most common word is inspired or inspirational.
And where do you get most of your visitors from then? Are most of them from the UK, or do you get a lot of people coming over from the States?
Quite a lot come over from the States, obviously pre-COVID. They make a pilgrimage essentially. We do a lot of work with primary schools and with the John Muir Trust and the John Muir Award in Britain. And it's now an end point of the John Muir Way, which is a cross-country, central Scotland trail from Helensburgh in the west to Dunbar in the east. and it's called the John Muir Way. It's a bit like the John Muir Trail in this the Sierra, High Sierra. It's named after John Muir, and that was opened in, oh, I don't know, 10 years ago now.
I bet that brings all sorts of reprobates to your door. Fab.
Well, we get people coming in and saying, I've completed the John Muir Way, can I have my certificate? And we're more than happy to do that. In fact, I personally welcomed a long distance runner who set out from Helensburgh 22 hours before arriving in Dunbar. And it's 130 miles in 22 hours. He did pretty well.
That is good going. Although I don't imagine the great man would have approved. He seemed to like to take things nice and slow and steady. He
saunter. A saunter was one of his favourite words.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Fab. Brilliant. Well, we'll talk a bit more about his early life, because I think it sets it all in context. But we'll do that in a minute. We're joined by someone else from over the pond, who's Michelle Nijhuis, she's not featured in Adventurous Inc., oddly. But she has featured in my other book club. Most of you will know I also run the Do Book Club. And a couple of months back, we featured this fabulous book, Beloved Beasts by Michelle, which is all about the history of the conservation movement. And I thought I knew quite a bit about the conservation movement, and I learned so much from this book. So Michelle, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really delighted to have had you in both my book clubs now. I'm sorry we've not been able to feature your book in Adventurous Inc. But I mean, you must come across Muir time and time again in your work and references to him. But can you remember the first time that you came across him?
Hi, Tim, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I am trying to think back on my first encounter with John Muir, and I think it must have been as a teenager who was interested in environmental issues. I probably ran into plenty of misquotes before I found my way to the real quotes. And I read bits of My Summer in the Sierra and his other writings, My First Summer in the Sierra, and then when I became a journalist and started writing about conservation and the environment and climate change, I started to read him more closely. But I didn't really take a deep dive until I was writing my book, Beloved Beast, about the history of conservation. And I wanted to read John Muir's original works and put so many of his quotes, his often quoted phrases, into the context that they deserve.
And I think we'll talk a bit about the context, because I think particularly for us in the UK, it's difficult to put ourselves back 150 years into a place that isn't even really part of our national history. So particularly the two of you from over the pond, I'm sure you'll help us put Muir into context. Finally, I'm going to bring in Jeff. Hello, Jeff. Thank you so much for joining us. Jeff was quite instrumental in my setting out, I guess, as a entrepreneur in the outdoor scene, because Jeff wrote and edited this fabulous book, The Outsider's New Outdoor Creativity, and I read this just before I started my first outdoor business, and it really gave me an insight into the idea that there was something different happening in the outdoor scene compared to when I started. I am, believe it or not, I am old enough that my first pair of walking trousers were a pair of knee-length breeches, and I also had the full knee-high woolly socks. Now you wouldn't believe it, I know, I'm baby face, but that's what it was like when I started out. Jeff, thank you for joining us. When did you come across Muir? You must have run into him time and time again in your career.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm one of the social media generation, so obviously it began to spring up in the early days of things like Tumblr and Instagram when it first started, and his quotes were always on top of a really cool or inspiring picture of the outdoors, whether it was the mountains, forests, and it kind of like started to just scratch a little itch I had at the time, that there was something more from the kind of urbanized life I was living. And then begun to spend a bit more time outside, started reading some of his wilderness essays and connecting a bit deeper to the quotes. And then kind of then looked sort of in parallel to what was starting to happen in the actual sort of contemporary outdoor scene, and looking at the younger brands that were just coming up and, you know, with the same ethos and attitude as Muir, but sort of pushing that outdoor space or pushing outdoor culture into a completely new space, but with the same kind of principles about conservation, connection, and all that kind of good stuff that he's known for, which is still totally relevant today. And yeah, and then his quotes are peppered through both the Outsiders books, and yeah, I think you just sort of stumbled across him, and then yeah, you start to dig deeper once you want to understand a bit more, really.
He's like a gateway, I'm sure, for so many people.
Yeah.
So let's try and understand why he was such an influential writer, such an influential thinker. Duncan, can you take us back to his early life? Why did he? What was he doing in Scotland, and why did he leave?
Well, he left when he was essentially 9 years old. He was born in 1838 and left in 1840. No, 1849. So he was almost 11 years old. And essentially, he was a typical youngster in a seaside town where there were essentially two factions, the streeties and the shories. The shories were the people who lived near the shore and the harbour, and the streeties were the people who lived near the high street and so on. His father was extremely disciplinarian, so he did not have an easy life. And essentially, it was his maternal grandfather, David Gorai, that really essentially negated or neutralized his father's influence. He was a very religious man. So he would do all sorts of things. You know, he would climb the old castle. He would do scooches, you know, one of the famous ones when he moved next door from his birthplace when his father had become much more prosperous and could afford servants and so on.
You've lost me there. Scooches.
Scooches, yeah. Essentially dares. So his brother, you know, his brother David and John Muir shared a bedroom on the top floor. And we're talking about a 3-story building. And David dared him to go out onto the roof, climb out on the roof at night. And he did. And then he climbed back in. And then David tried to do it and got stuck. So John Muir said, slide down, I'll catch you. Unfortunately, he did, because if he hadn't, his brother would be dead. So that was a sort of a typical dare scoocher.
You can see his character that comes across, yeah, even in that reading back there. You know, there is a real maverick sort of risk-taking element to him, isn't there?
Yeah, I think it was probably a reaction against his father being such a hard disciplinarian, his schooling. I think one of the quotes from his book is, you know, this is a misquote, so, you know, please bear with me, Harold. That it's essentially saying there's a link between the flesh and the memory, and so essentially he learned the whole of the Bible because people would thrash it into him, and he'd have to learn it before the next day. And when he moved, when he actually emigrated in 1849, he was with his maternal grandfather doing the homework, and his father came in and said, "Don't bother doing your homework today, boys. We're going to America in the morning." And that was it. Wow. So that was the start. So took the train from Dunbar to Glasgow, caught the Warren, 6-week journey over to America, and settled initially in Wisconsin.
And why did his dad take them over there then? Was
religious reasons. He didn't like the religious situation in Scotland. It wasn't harsh enough. It wasn't religious enough. So he's essentially wanted to go and, you know, pursue his own religious fervor. Uh,
Gosh.
yeah, so it's essentially that.
That I mean, that paints a picture of an incredible man. So when he got to the States, would he have carried on with his schooling?
No. He then became essentially, slave's the wrong word, but his father would put him to work on the farm. He had a near-death experience digging a well, and essentially dug a well, and it was digging it and got to the bottom of it. It was it coal damp? Is it carbon monoxide?
Choke damp,
Choke
like
damp.
carbon monoxide
Yeah,
settles
yeah,
at the bottom.
yeah. And he basically had to be pulled out by his father, near-death experience. And one of the interesting stories about Muir is that because his father was such a disciplinarian, wouldn't allow him to read books other than the Bible. And so Muir said, "Well, okay, Dad, or Father, when can I do it?" And his father said, "Okay, if you get up before work, then you can do that." So he would essentially wake at about 4 o'clock in the morning and do all his reading. And he became a great inventor as well. And so he went to the University of Wisconsin. And remember, this is when he didn't have a formal education from the age of 9. And his inventions were so amazing, he essentially got accepted into the University of Wisconsin. And he became an inventor, an engineer in many ways. And as a result of that, he got a job in a coachworks post University of Wisconsin. And as he was working on the sort of steam-driven belts, the belt situation where the production line, he was actually levering up a staple out of a leather belt, and the needle end of the file pierced his eye, and he lost sight in that eye. His other eye essentially shut down too, and so he became blind. And he realized that he wasn't going to pursue human work. He would do things in nature. And he recovered his eyesight. And then that was essentially why he went 1,000-mile walk and essentially became a tramp. And that,
But I mean, it was clearly an experience that he took so much from, and when you hear about, well, 2 horrendous experiences there, two horrendous accidents, you can understand why, and that upbringing, it starts to paint a picture of needing to do something else to get away from that. The accident in the factory, though, that must have been a real game changer. That sounds like the pivotal moment. Is that right?
I would say, and I think Carol would agree, that was a pivotal moment in his life.
Well,
he thought he was blind. Yeah.
I would add that was what made him decide to start on his 1,000-mile walk. But I would say it was probably his overnight stay in Savannah, Georgia at the Bonaventure Cemetery, where he slept in the cemetery because his brother hadn't sent his money yet, so he couldn't stay in a hotel. And so he was camping out at the edge of town, and he figured the cemetery is the safest place from thieves and vagabonds. And he started meditating about death. And in the cemetery, it was and is a beautiful cemetery with draping Spanish moss, beautiful oak trees, vegetation everywhere, and he sort of had this moment about death, and he probably caught malaria. He left there when he got his money, walked from there to a boat down the coastal islands of Georgia, and then walked across Florida to Cedar Key, Florida. And there he had another pivotal experience, near-death experience, because he had malaria. And he was trying to get a job until he could get a passage to go to South America. And one day he was going back to the labor camp, or the mill where he was working, and and he fell in a dead faint, and the people wouldn't help him. They thought he was just drunk. And finally, the wife of the proprietor of this mill, who employed him, realized, no, this man's sick. And so she nurtured him back to health. And so he had a long time to think about life and death at that point. And that's also the pivotal moment where he decided alligators had as much right to live as human beings, mosquitoes had as much right to live as human beings. And you see in the Thousand Mile Walk, he talks about lizards being our fellow mortals and having as much right to be here as anything else. And that was a pivotal moment, I would say, of his philosophical conception of nature as not made for human beings, but each thing made for itself. And we should delight that each thing has its own life and is loved by God no matter what it is, even if it's a bloodthirsty alligator or a lion or a tiger or a mosquito that wants to kill you. He talks about that quite a bit. That the rattlesnake has as much right to live as you do.
And for the time, go on, Michelle, go for it. Sorry, it's just everyone feel free to chip in as we go along. There's so many of us. I'm sure you've all got stuff to contribute, so feel free to chip in. It can be a bit difficult on Zoom, I know. So I will always defer to you guys. So Michelle, go for it.
Just one thing I'd like to add about his early life. We think of him as the poet or a poet of the Sierra, but he spent his formative years in central Wisconsin, as Duncan said, and a very beautiful part of Wisconsin at a time when there was a lot more native prairie than there is now. And even though Muir had quite a bleak childhood and adolescence in many ways, when he could get away from his father, one of the things he liked to do was to climb up this very ancient knob of rock in the middle of the prairie called Observatory Hill, which I had the chance to climb up a couple of years ago before the pandemic. And from the top, you can just about see Aldo Leopold's shack. You can't see the shack itself, but you can just about see where it's located. And so John Muir grew up in a place that was almost literally a stone's throw from where Aldo Leopold decades later would conduct a famous prairie restoration project that still stands today. So I think he retained a real, even though, his most lyrical writings are about the Sierra, I think he did retain a real appreciation for the prairie and the prairie ecosystem throughout his life.
Amazing.
I guess he began botanizing, learning about the flowers and identifying them. So you see in Thousand Mile Walk, he's using scientific names for a lot of things, but he was doing that way back in Wisconsin. The other thing about Wisconsin, the Wisconsinites like to kind of pride themselves because they say, in the beginning there was John Muir, and then he begat Aldo Leopold, because Aldo Leopold in his book Sound County Almanac, which you haven't read yet in your book club, you must read.
We've not actually. No, thank you.
Maybe you've already seen it, seen the passenger pigeons and so forth. And then Aldo Leopold's writings begat Gaylord Nelson, who became a United States Senator from Wisconsin, and he was the founder of Earth Day in 1970. So I see this unbroken chain of inspiration from John Muir to modern Earth Day and our concern about protecting the Earth as a whole and protecting Gaia and climate change and all of that. It's not just about a 150 years old book moldering in a library. It's a living inspiration to us today.
Wow.
Yeah, Wisconsin has a really vital conservation tradition, a political tradition, as well as a literary tradition that, despite Governor Scott Walker's best efforts, is still vital.
That's fascinating. You mentioned the literary history there. So was Muir, when he came to his conclusion about the validity of life for alligators and stuff, had he come to that conclusion on his own? Was he influenced by other natural philosophers? Where did that come from?
I would say a lot of that came from Alexander von Humboldt. There's been, he mentions that in his book on the story of my boyhood and youth, that when his father told him we were going to go to the New World, he had this imaginings about Alexander von Humboldt. Now I don't know how much of this was written in retrospect, because it's hard for me to believe 11-year-old boy is reading Alexander von Humboldt, but maybe he was, because he was popular. There may have been excerpts in magazines and stuff at the time period, but you can certainly see there's a passage in Thousand Mile Walk, and in my first time in the Sierra, where he talks about climbing from the high alpine down to the hot desert of Mono Lake, and he said it's like going from Canada, northern Canada, down to Florida. Well, that's straight out of Alexander von Humboldt, who made that observation first about 150 years earlier. So he clearly got a lot of inspiration beginning with Alexander von Humboldt. And even at the time of my first summer in the Sierra, remember, he was reading Emerson. He had Emerson's essays, and he's read his book Self-Reliance and was underlining passages. And then later, when he was there, not during the first summer, but later when he was in Yosemite, Emerson visited and got to meet him, and he was like hero worship. Emerson was so important to him. And they don't mention Thoreau, but clearly he read Thoreau as well, because there's lots of things that are evocative, or sort of quotations building on what Thoreau had written.
And one more would be Robert Burns.
Yes.
As well.
Good. Very important.
He had a copy of Robert Burns's poems and writing with him all the time.
Muir was so ahead of his time in his view of animals, and especially individual animals. He drew from all these influences, but I think one way in which he was quite unusual is that moment of realization with the alligator was an expression of this empathy with other species and individuals from other species that had been building in him and continued throughout his life, and was just so unusual, so ahead of its time. There were animal rights activists at the time, but they didn't think much of predators. They kind of picked and chose the animals that they liked, and Muir saw all of the other forms of life as deserving of attention and care, and of possessing some form of rights. We'll talk more about the ways in which Muir was not ahead of his time, and we'll talk some about his blind spots, but that is one way in which he very much was.
And that's a fair characterization, is it? Because that's always been my impression, that he was out of his time in an era that was very much dominated by conquest and a utilitarian view of nature. What can we get from this? Is that right? Was he really an outlier, or were there other people with similar views, other movements that he would have kind of ascribed to?
The conservation movement was certainly getting started, and the preservation movement, which I'm sure Duncan and Harold can talk more about, was also underway by the late 1800s. But in terms of just his empathy for other species, I would say, was quite unusual, if not unique. He referred to other animals as his horizontal brothers, which is a phrase I love. And I mean, he brought that care for other species and that perception of them as individuals, in some sense, with equal standing to humans. He brought that sensibility into the conservation and environmental movements.
In some respects, he was probably more had more empathy for other species than for mankind.
Very true.
So talking about mankind. So obviously, Michelle sort of alluded to it there, and there was a lot going on at the time, and really, I guess it was a time when First Nations people were being wiped out, moved off their land, and I know he's been criticised by some of late for not being as aware as he might have been of what was going on. what's your take on that side of things? Because it's particularly, again, for the UK audience, it's hard to position these things in historical context. So we don't really know what was happening in San Francisco and in the Sierra at this time, and how much progress was being made to the west, or whether the west had already been won. And so helping us understand that would be really useful, and then where Muir fitted into that.
Can I respond to some of that? Some of that time, although the California Indians had been civilized for a long time, in some senses, the Spanish missionaries on the coast, and they had their traditional ways in the mountains and in the Indians. In Nevada, that area, there were parts of the country that there were still Indian wars going on, including the Southwest with the Apaches. And sometimes people criticize Muir's writings, but there was a friend of his that in the 1880s climbed the mountain you see behind me. Was the first woman to climb that mountain. And the guide she was with said, well, we don't really have a name for this, so I'm going to call it Mount Lemon after you, Sarah. Sarah Lemon was her name. She had some experiences where she was within a few miles of marauding Apaches who were killing settlers in southeast Arizona. And she wrote a thing about, I wish all of them were dead. And Muir never wrote anything that badly. And in fact, if you read through, I reread a little bit of my first summer, and there's some disparaging remarks about Native Americans. There's also some laudatory remarks. He seems to be very much intrigued about their ability to live off the land and to be able to survive without having to cultivate it and change it. And he contrasts how their way of life has such minor impact on the landscape and the wildlife, compared to the white people who are mining and destroying, and everything is going to last in scars on the earth for hundreds of years. And when you read that proto meeting, where his first time meeting Native Americans, he's a little hesitant. Well, why shouldn't he be? Given the time, there was still some outbreaks of Indian wars. He felt most of them had been herded into reservations and treated terribly throughout the United States by then. But he then went to Alaska. And this is pretty early, 1880. He goes to Alaska and meets the Native Americans there. And it's like, oh, this is very different. These Native Americans were much closer to the landscape. They hadn't been degraded by the white man's ways, which the California Indians he felt had been. And he really admired and respected him. And from the books that were written by observers at the time, he was admired by the Indians as well. And there's a book called Across the Shaman's Way, written by an Alaskan who spent equal time in the library with interviewing Native Americans, getting their oral tradition about John Muir and the white settlers that came in. And they said, John Muir was the first white man we ever met who didn't want something from us. He didn't want furs. He didn't want to tell us where gold was and all that. He just treated us like people. And when the missionaries, the Presbyterian missionaries would talk about God and stuff, the Indians go, oh yeah, okay, sure. And then when John Muir talked about God loves everybody, no matter what color their skin is, then they perked right up, and they eventually converted, but partially because of John Muir, because he envisioned an idea of Christianity as one of equality of all people, regardless of race, creed, or color, from around the world. And there's passages that very strongly he talks about that. So even if there are some negative things, some of his earlier writings, in context, I think it's impossible to say Muir was a racist, because, as Duncan said, he was inspired by Robert Burns' writings about a man's a man for all that, and brothers be, we shall be. That was his goal, that was his ideal throughout his life. And there's other passages that don't commonly see the light of day that were written in letters, where he talks about God is not just for those among favored races and nations. little spots here and there. It's for everybody and all animals and all people. So, I think he's given short shrift some of the modern bloggers who write about Muir. They've not read enough of him to realize how largesse his worldview became, which was really remarkable given the time period again. And I'm not saying he didn't have some blind spots, but some of those blind spots were things that were of the time. He had a Chinese cook in his house, and that Chinese cook at one time was the only person in the house. His family had died, or his wife had died, and his children had moved away, got married. I can't believe that they didn't have some friendship there with his Chinese cook and him. And there was times he was writing about being sick with what we would now call the flu, and this Chinese servant, if you will, was taking care of him. But clearly there was respect there and love. So I don't know. I don't buy into Muir as a racist theory that's being articulated by a lot of people. And I base that because of a broader reading of Muir's life than most people have been able to accomplish.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that by saying Harold is a leading authority on this. So he's got resources that counter some of this clickbait, and it literally was clickbait, bloggers and so on, just picking up headlines, misrepresenting it out of context. And I agree with Harold entirely. Muir was, I think somebody described him as the least racist American of his time. And I think that's the case. And certainly his experience of Alaska and the Native Americans, the native tribes there who adopted Muir. And Muir got into arguments with the settlers, with the military there, and he would argue against this appropriation of their lands and resources. But people who want to do the clickbait and call Muir a racist, they don't want to look at that because it's not on their agenda. It doesn't support their world view. So check out Harold's resources because they give you a much more balanced viewpoint.
And it's go on, Michelle, go on. 'Cause I know you've written about this.
Yeah. To me, the interesting question is not whether John Muir was a racist, because it's impossible for us to say. And I think that question can get us into zero-sum Twitter battles to which there is no answer. To me, the interesting question is what is the legacy of the values and attitudes that he expressed? What is the legacy of those attitudes within the conservation movement? And so, I mean, to me, Muir's, so-called sins are both not as bad as often portrayed, and also worse, because I think it's very easy to pick out, as Harold and Duncan are saying, it's very easy to pick out phrases from among a body of work, much of which was journal entries jotted down and may not have reflected a deeply held value, or may have, but certainly were a moment in a very long and productive life. But I think throughout his life, he did often express an attitude toward the places he loved, as he saw them as clean places, as largely unpeopled landscapes, and he loved them for that. And one of the phrases that often gets picked out and criticized, and I do think is quite telling, actually, knowing the context of Muir's work, is that when he runs into members of the Sierra Miwok tribe in Yosemite, he says they seem to have no right place in the landscape. And I think that reflected his true love of the beauty of the Sierra and his joy at getting away from civilization. but I do think that that attitude has had a it cast a long shadow in the conservation movement, especially when the conservation movement moved out of North America and Europe and went to Africa, when parks and preserves were seen as places where people either could not enter or needed to be kicked out of. That attitude, oops, excuse me, that that attitude toward wilderness as unpeopled landscapes, as a place where people had no established relationship, as places with no history. I think that's been a pernicious influence, and it's something that the conservation movement is rightly wrestling with, and has a long way to go in doing so.
Such a tricky one. I think
Yeah,
the
I
thing,
agree with that about Africa and the other countries. It's clearly, you can't just put a fence around a place and call it a national park, and then that's now preserved and kick people out. And much of those, there was Indian removals from national parks long after Muir had died, and he gets blamed for it. But he was died, and then the Park Service started, expelling the natives from some of the national parks, and he gets the blame. But I do think that was wrong and is wrong. Um, the uh, the bigger picture is that you do have to have that balance. And one of the things I found is that Muir, in his journals, he traveled around the world towards the end of his life, and you know he spent a month in India, and it's very interesting reading what he wrote about the people he saw there compared to the typical British Empire description of the natives of India, and how much more open he was. So I think the important thing is that what Michelle is saying is there was this legacy that of the National Park Service that needs to be modified and bringing the Native American perspective into place better. I live about 2 miles from a Hohokam village, and it's wondrous to kind of see that these people survived in this harsh desert environment and went up to the mountains 11 miles away and brought down ponderosa pine. I mean, this is an amazing feat, and I think the Park Service is beginning to do that more and more to in some cases correct historically inaccurate signage, for example, in Yosemite, that wrote everything from the pioneers' perspective and trying to point out about the natives living there peacefully. And I think John Muir would have approved of that because he said how they lived lightly in the land. So I think it was the ones that had been out of place were the ones that were really not being native, and it's easier to get the romantic idea of the romantic savage, but he encountered different kinds of Indians, and he talks about how the Miwok and the Paiute were fighting each other, and it's hard to talk about Native Americans in one broad brush because there were lots of different tribes with lots of different attitudes and lots of different ways of life. The Apaches are completely different than the ones who were farming along the Gila River, for example. So it's just it's complicated, and you need to study that. And when you go to Africa and those places, you have to do the same.
Yeah, I would agree. The one thing I would add is that I think, the people, those within and without the Sierra Club who have been critical of Muir's legacy in recent times are not. Yes, there are some who are kind of playing gotcha with his writings, but I think there are some who are very aware of the context, and also aware of the ways in which his writing, his evocations of these unpeopled landscapes, are aware of the shadow of that legacy on the conservation movement, and are aware that it has that tradition within the environmental movement needs some really deep examination. So I think that there's part of that discussion that shouldn't be dismissed as just a back and forth over certain words and phrases. I think there is a much deeper awareness, and a serious discussion to be had.
I would recommend johnmuir.org website that has the lead article. At the top of that is an article by Bruce Byers, and he talks about going to the history of the Wilderness Act in 1964, and how they very deliberately used the word untrammeled. Wilderness is untrammeled, and that doesn't mean unpeopled. And I think there has been, there was this period, I think in the 20s and 30s, that it was unpeopled. But by 1964 with the Wilderness Act, you're already beginning this changeover to say it's untrammeled landscape. I recommend that article by Bruce Byers because he addresses precisely what you're saying, that what wilderness meant by the proponents of the Wilderness Act was not unpeopled wilderness, but untrammeled wilderness. And to me, Muir said that so much in his writings of both California Indians, Nevada Indians, Arizona and Alaska Indians. He admired how they lived in harmony with the landscape and compared that favorably to how the white people were mistreating the land. So I think we can actually build on that and come to its common ground.
I think the thing that strikes me is that there's an interesting duality here between Muir, who sees himself as on a spectrum with nature and part of a natural continuum, and I guess by extension you would expect him to extend other humanity to that, but then there is this residual wanting it to be free of people, I guess, and what it makes me think about, there's a strange duality here as well with Muir being othered and kind of being put out there as, well, he got all his views wrong in an era when the outdoor movement is trying to be a lot more diverse and bring whole different set of viewpoints and people into into connection with the natural world. And I don't think it serves anyone well to be othering anyone in this context. Jeff, I know you've been doing quite a lot of work on diversity and helping outdoor brands kind of engage with people who aren't traditionally associated with the outdoors. How does this work its way through into their work and your thinking? Can you see the parallels there?
Yeah, it's been really interesting to hear people, well, you guys talk really in depth about what can be taken as very, inspirational quotes, but without much depth behind it. So I think the thing I'm taking away from it is the parallels today, especially the work I'm doing, is this idea that everybody has a right to be there, or the animals have the same right as humans. And I think you apply that to the national parks in the UK. I live in the Lake District, and it's overwhelmed with people coming, and I think everybody has a right to be here. It's no longer this enclosed traditional outdoor experience. It's now quite open, diverse, and inclusive. And I think that kind of thinking is what I'm trying to bring into the outdoor brands who need to shift and move forward and kind of diversify themselves as well, because as an outdoor brand, you're encouraging people to spend time outside. You have to be able to represent the people that you're telling to come outside, but also then the other side of this is the conservation side and the understanding and education around having minimal impact on the places you are visiting. So there's kind of quite a lot of different threads I'm listening to and pulling together and connecting. And it's exactly what we said at the start. What Muir said in the 1800s is just as relevant as it is today. And modern outdoor brands, modern outdoor users are wrestling with exactly the same kind of issues around who has the right to be here, who was here first, how do we live with nature, how do we conserve the places we're going into and sending what is literally millions of people into our UK national parks without creating such a big imprint and impact. It's all the same things, but yeah, trying to wrestle with that today is an interesting challenge really for brands, I think. And they're creating products as well, which is having a wider impact on the environment. So it's very interesting space,
especially when we've got lots of outdoor brands who really are only now starting to come around and see the importance of Muir's connection with the natural world. Because for a long time, outdoor brands were adventure brands, and there was that conquest thing, wasn't there? For me, it feels very similar to the context in which Muir was operating at the time. And yet I think some of the things that you've documented, Jeff, are maybe people coming back to nature after time spent in an urban environment, and recognizing that separation has given them a new perspective on them, and a new understanding of the importance of connection, which is something that Muir found so long ago. I mean, I'm still staggered by the relevance of it now, possibly even more relevant than it was at the time.
Yeah, definitely. I think this connection is the key word that I use with a lot of the brands, because a lot of people are trying to reconnect, I suppose, is the real word, because we're already very connected in a very disconnected way. And I think the outdoors and that experience and what the kind of philosophy of Muir has brought to it is this idea of not conquering the highest mountain, but actually going out there and connecting to nature, which eventually leads to connecting to self and the others. And then a whole ecosystem forms of, as you connect to yourself, you understand the place that you're in, you connect to the place, and then you have I suppose, a deeper understanding, connection to do more to preserve the spaces you're in. So yeah, I think that kind of whole approach to slow.
Sorry about that. Jamie's on a roller coaster. Carry on. Jamie, I've muted you. Sorry about that. Go on, Jeff.
Wow. It's a good place to watch this. Yeah, it's definitely, the perspective of the outdoors has shifted so much. And again, it's looking all the way back to Muir's quotes are so relevant today, the topics that we're dealing with. And it's really interesting.
I'm interested in everyone's take on what Muir would make of the environment today. And Yosemite's on fire. We're facing a climate emergency. What would he make of it, and what would he have to say to us? I know it's a big question.
I guess I would depart from the question a little bit, and I know we're getting to the end of our time together. I would just say that he'd be horrified by so many things, the climate emergency, perhaps most of all. What I think is important when I look at Muir's legacy, there's so many, so many insights, so much beautiful writing of his that I appreciate and think is so relevant today, but it's not the only bit of writing, of course, that I find relevant and powerful to us today. And Gary Young the sociologist Gary Young had a great essay in The Guardian a couple of years ago about, it was called something like, we should just pull down all our statues. And I think part of the discussion about John Muir is that when we hold him up as an icon, we expect too much of him in a way. We expect him to be, an uncomplicated hero. And of course he's not. He had, as we've talked about, moments of great insight, perhaps moments of not so great insight. And I think it's important to remember that he is just as we are, parts of an interconnected ecosystem. He also is a part of an interconnected literary and historical ecosystem, and we should honor him as part of that, but not treat him as, the progenitor of it, or still sitting, still ruling it in some sense, because it is, of course, thank goodness, much wider and broader and deeper now than it was in his time.
And certainly the environmental movement evolved. Aldo Leopold brought evolution considerably forward for all of that as well. And I don't know that Muir ever really understood the importance of fire-adapted species, and he was pretty much against fire, and that turns out to have been a mistake, and that's why there's these forest fires in Yosemite right now, The area that's currently being burned it's a chaparral oak woodland ecosystem that is adapted to fire. It's supposed to be, according to nature, burned every 10 years or so, and it wasn't for decades and decades and decades. And so now we're seeing, these big fires. So I think that's important. The other thing, I think it's sort of unrelated to that, but Muir also failed to see the impact of the automobile in Yosemite. He thought that they were just blunt-nosed mechanical beetles, and it's fine to have their little puff of smoke. He didn't see it being a problem. He was so interested in getting people to see it so that they would love it and then protect it, that he could not foresee what happened, to the point that just before the pandemic, in the first year of the pandemic, people literally were driving into Yosemite Valley, were told by the Park Service, you cannot stop unless you find a parking place, and there was no parking space anywhere, and they would have to drive right out again. So this year they have started for the first time a permit system where you have to apply and get a permit reservation for one particular day that you want to go. And more of the parks are beginning to do that. And it should have been done a long time ago, because the impact of the overcrowding in Yosemite Valley is horrific. I mean, I lived 3 hours from it for several decades, and would often go, and I came to kind of hate it. I mean, people love Yosemite, and people always rave about the beauty of Yosemite. I would, except that I've been there so often when just hordes of people, automobiles everywhere, parked every which way. River is full of people, no animals could use it. Smoke from campfires was a major problem. Park Service finally outlawed those campfires because they would blanket the entire valley with campfire smoke. It'd be worse pollution than it was in the city. So there's still a lot we have to do about how to manage national parks. In some ways, I would turn over the management of Yosemite to the Indians. I think they do a lot better job than the National Park Service does.
Yeah. Duncan, Jeff, have you got final thoughts on Muir's relevance today, and what he would make of the mess that we're in?
Probably similar to all of us, really, I guess. Very there's a lot to unpick and unpack and get right, and yeah, I don't know. I think you probably feel the same as we all do, really.
It's an interesting question. It's one that we've been grappling with the Birthplace Trust, because we want to augment the exhibition material and the messages in the Birthplace that was set in stone at 2000. At the start of when it was opened in 2003. A lot has happened in the last 19 years. It's 20 years anniversary next year. We're thinking about upgrading the top floor, which is Muir's legacy. And one of the things I think that we need to address is the fact that Muir had a voice. He wrote articles, was at The Atlantic. He wrote letters. He published books and so on. He was an influencer. And in many respects, he was before his time, because he actually took on board writing these articles in The Atlantic, influencing people. And I think if he was alive today, he'd be on the same sort of level as we have with the likes of David Attenborough or Greta Thunberg. His message would be out there, as it was in his day, and he had a great deal of influence.
Hang on. So Muir wrote for The Atlantic. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes, in fact, I just posted a link to his archived writings from The Atlantic. I'm a project editor for The Atlantic, and The Atlantic has spent the last 18 months pulling together its 100+ years of archives, including the works by John Muir, so that you can, if you go to that link, you can see all of his Atlantic writings online now.
Wow, amazing.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we for those of you who don't get a chance to jump on all those links, I'll save the chat. I'll add them to this month's email, which is really about. I'll let you into a secret. So my emails, when I send them out at the end of every month, they're already written. I've already written this month's email, and it talks about exactly what Harold was telling us about, exactly what Michelle was telling us about this chain that's being passed on from person to person, from Muir down through Aldo Leopold, down through successive activists and environmentalists. And it's now that we're seeing the importance of this, and I can't believe that the conversation has revealed even more of that. It's been absolutely fascinating, and let's face it, we've never had someone diving in on a roller coaster either. So that's a new on us all. Who knows what happened there? Charlotte did mention, and I was going to mention it as well. We've heard recently about the very sad loss of James Lovelock, another massive influence on the environmental movement. You know, really out there with his thoughts. He was a provocateur par excellence. But I think what they both do is help us ask questions. And I think Michelle has quite rightly pointed to the fact that we can't put people up on a pedestal and expect them to be perfect. But what we can do is look at what they have to tell us and reflect on what that means. I've never seen so many erudite comments coming in through the chat. Thank you, everybody. But I would have loved to go on and on. We've run out of time. It was inevitable talking about such a great man that we'd only have a small time to fit in his stuff. If we feature another of his books, we'll bring them all back and we'll talk about it all again. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Harold. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Jeff. It's been fabulous. Your contributions have been enlightening. Just wonderful. Thank you all. It's been absolutely brilliant. Everyone else, well, we'll do it again. Not quite in a month's time, actually. Our next conversation is going to be on the 1st of September, when we'll be meeting August's author, and that's basically because I'm going to be on holiday on the last Thursday of the month. So, right, I will take everyone off pin. We can do the wavy goodbye thing, and then we can all go home or go downstairs or upstairs to our nearest and dearest, wherever they might be. Right, fab. Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Jamie on
Enjoy your time. Enjoy your time outdoors.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Harold.
Take care. Bye.
Cheers, Jeff.